The rain drummed against the floor-to-ceiling glass of the gala, a cold contrast to the suffocating heat of the betrayal unfolding inside. Adrienne Vance, 55 years old and recently stripped of her title as co-founder, stood motionless as a security guard placed a hand on her elbow. Across the room, Dominic, her husband of 25 years, was laughing. He didn't look at her as he signed the merger papers that effectively deleted her from the company they had built in their garage 2 decades ago. By the time the sun rose, Adrienne would be standing in a derelict kitchen on the edge of the city, holding a rusted key that was about to turn Dominic's polished world into a pile of ash. Hello, friends. Welcome to Morel Folktales. We are so glad you are here with us today. If you enjoy deep, emotional journeys of resilience and justice, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a premiere. Please give this video a like. It truly helps us grow, and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Are you joining us from the sun of Florida, the streets of London, the beauty of South Africa, or perhaps the quiet of Canada? We love reading your locations and welcoming you into our community. The silence in the penthouse was heavier than the betrayal itself. Dominic sat across from Adrienne at the mahogany dining table, a stack of legal documents between them that looked more like a tombstone than a divorce settlement. He was 48, 7 years younger than Adrienne, with a face meticulously maintained by high-end dermatologists and the arrogance that comes with being the face of a tech architecture empire. He didn't look angry. He looked bored. He pushed a silver pen toward her with a manicured finger, his voice steady and devoid of the warmth that had defined their first 2 decades together. He told her that the prenuptial agreement, which she had signed in a haze of romantic trust 25 years ago, had been updated and ratified through 3 different shell corporations she hadn't even known existed. He had spent the last 18 months moving pieces on a chessboard while she was busy managing their international firm's day-to-day operations. Dominic had structured every dollar, every investment, and every patent so carefully that her name had been systematically scrubbed from their history. The lawyers had been thorough. They had been paid with her own money to ensure she left with nothing but the clothes on her back and a modest lump sum of $50,000, a parting gift, Dominic called it, to ensure she didn't starve while she found herself in middle age. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply picked up the pen and signed. The transition from the pinnacle of high society to the grit of the industrial district happened in a heartbeat. Adrienne moved into a small, damp studio and spent the first week staring at the wall, listening to the radiator hiss. She was 55, a woman the industry considered retired, while Dominic was being hailed as the visionary genius of the decade. He had already replaced her in the office with a 30-year-old lead designer who looked like a younger, more malleable version of Adrienne herself. But Dominic had made one mistake. In his rush to strip her of every asset that had a visible value on a balance sheet, he had overlooked a small, dilapidated property on the corner of 4th and Mason. It was a crumbling brick building that used to be a bistro, bought under a defunct subsidiary they had abandoned 8 years ago. To Dominic, it was a liability, a tax write-off he had forgotten to even include in the seizure list. Adrienne spent $45,000 of her $50,000, nearly her entire net worth, buying that specific property back from the holding company before Dominic's lawyers realized it was still technically in her maiden name. It was a gamble that looked like madness. Her friends thought she had suffered a nervous breakdown. They whispered about poor Adrienne, who had gone from designing skyscrapers to buying a grease-stained kitchen in a part of town where the streetlights didn't work. But Adrienne knew something Dominic didn't. She remembered the day they bought that building, and she remembered exactly what was hidden behind the false wall in the basement storage room. The day she took possession of the keys, the air was thick with the scent of old dust and stale cooking oil. Adrienne walked through the skeletal remains of the dining room, her designer heels clicking on the cracked linoleum. She looked like a ghost of her former life, wearing a cashmere coat in a room that smelled of rot. She went straight to the kitchen, past the rusted stoves and the moldy walk-in freezer, to a heavy steel door in the far corner. It was the dry storage, according to the blueprints. She struggled with the rusted padlock, her hands shaking not from cold, but from the sheer weight of what she was about to do. When the lock finally snapped, the door groaned open to reveal a cramped, windowless room filled with old crates. She began moving the boxes, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Behind a stack of ancient tax records and architectural magazines, she found it. A small, fireproof floor safe that was never registered in the company's digital inventory. 8 years ago, when the company was facing its first major audit, Dominic had been panicked. He had been cutting corners on a major municipal project, using substandard materials to pad their margins. Adrian had found out, and, in a moment of protective instinct that she now bitterly regretted, she had helped him hide the physical evidence, the original blueprints, the genuine material receipts, and the private ledgers that showed exactly where the diverted funds had gone. She had saved him then. Now, she was going to use those same documents to bury him. But the safe held more than just corporate secrets. As Adrian knelt on the cold concrete floor, she pulled out a leather-bound journal. It wasn't hers, it was Dominic's. He had kept it during the first 5 years of their marriage, a period he now claimed was a time of solo struggle before Adrienne's contributions leveled up the firm. In those pages, in his own handwriting, he detailed how he had systematically gaslit her from day one. He wrote about his long-term strategy to eventually divorce her once the firm reached a certain valuation, noting how he was intentionally keeping her name off specific patents. It was a blueprint for betrayal that dated back decades. He hadn't just fallen out of love. He had been a predator from the start. If you are still watching at this point, please drop a comment with the word justice below. It lets us know you are following Adrienne's journey closely and supports the channel in bringing more of these stories to life. We truly appreciate your loyalty and your time. Adrienne sat on the floor of that dark room for hours, the journal in her lap. The betrayal went deeper than money. It was a total theft of her identity. Dominic was currently preparing for the gala of the century, where he was expected to receive a Lifetime Achievement Award for a structural design that Adrienne had actually drawn while she was recovering from a fever in their 3rd year of business. He was at the height of his power, untouchable and arrogant. He thought he had left her with nothing but a crumbling restaurant and a broken heart. He didn't realize that in leaving her that building, he had handed her the detonator to his entire life. She looked at the ticking clock on her phone. She had exactly 21 days until the gala. 21 days to turn this collapsing restaurant into a trap. She didn't start by calling a lawyer. She started by cleaning. For the next 2 weeks, Adrienne Vance, the woman who used to command a staff of 200, scrubbed floors and painted walls. She used her remaining $5,000 to buy basic supplies and hired a local teenager to help with the heavy lifting. But the restaurant was a front. While the windows were papered over with "opening soon" signs, Adrienne was spent her nights in the back room with a high-speed scanner. She was digitizing every page of the journal, every receipt, and every fraudulent blueprint. She was also reaching out to the ghosts, the former employees Dominic had fired or bullied into silence over the years. She didn't offer them money. She offered them a chance to see the king fall. One of those ghosts was Marcus, a brilliant structural engineer who had been disgraced when Dominic blamed him for a minor structural failure that was actually caused by Dominic's cost-cutting. Marcus lived in a small apartment 3 blocks away, working as a freelance draftsman. When Adrienne showed him the documents from the hidden safe, the man nearly wept. Together, they began to piece together a map of Dominic's current projects. They discovered that the same patterns of fraud were still happening, only on a much larger scale. Dominic was currently building a massive waterfront complex, the Vance Heights, that was being marketed as the pinnacle of safety and luxury. The documents in Adrienne's possession prove that the foundation was built on the same creative accounting and substandard concrete that they had hidden 8 years ago. The clock was winding down. On the 14th day, Adrienne received a legal notice. Dominic's lawyers had finally realized the Fourth and Mason property wasn't under their control. They offered her double what she paid to buy it back, an act of charity to help her move on. Adrienne declined the offer without a word. 2 days later, a building inspector showed up, clearly paid off, trying to find violations to shut her down. Adrienne met him at the door with a copy of the original 1920s deed she had found in the safe, which included a historical landmark protection clause Dominic had completely missed. The building couldn't be touched, and neither could she. The collapsing restaurant was becoming a fortress. By the 20th day, the neighborhood was buzzing. People were curious about the elegant woman who was working day and night on a derelict corner. Adrienne had transformed the front of the bistro into a simple, hauntingly beautiful space. She called it the Blueprint. It wasn't just a restaurant, it was a gallery. On the walls, she hung large-scale prints of architectural designs, sketches of buildings the city loved, but without the Vance Architects logo. She left them unsigned. She wanted people to see the soul of the work before they knew who had really drawn it. She was reclaiming her art before she reclaimed her life. The night before the gala, Dominic sent her a text. It was the first time he had contacted her directly since the divorce. It read, "I heard you're playing chef in a slum. Stop embarrassing yourself, Adrienne. It makes me look bad. Take the money and go to Europe." Adrienne didn't reply. Instead, she took a final look at the scanned files on her laptop. She had sent an anonymous gift to the 3 largest news outlets in the city and the board of the Architecture Association. It was a digital countdown clock that would expire at exactly 9 p.m. the following night, the same moment Dominic was scheduled to take the stage at the gala. The morning of the gala, the city was draped in a gray, persistent mist. Adrienne dressed with the same precision she used to apply to a multi-million-dollar pitch. She wore a deep charcoal suit, no jewelry, and her hair pulled back in a sharp, professional bun. She looked like a woman who was going to work, not a woman who was about to be publicly humiliated. She spent the morning in the Blueprint, preparing a single table in the center of the room. On it, she placed 2 glasses and a bottle of the wine they had shared on their wedding night. She then opened the front doors of the restaurant for the first time. She didn't expect customers. She was waiting for a visitor. As the afternoon faded into evening, the tension in the air was palpable. Across town, at the Grand Regency Ballroom, the elite of the city were gathering. Dominic Vance stood in front of a mirror, adjusting his tuxedo, basking in the glow of his impending coronation. He was the man of the hour, the genius who had streamlined his life and his company into a powerhouse of profit. He had no idea that at that very moment, a group of investigative journalists were huddled around a computer screen, watching a countdown clock and scrolling through files that detailed a 25-year history of fraud, theft, and emotional wreckage. Back at 4th and Mason, Adrienne sat at her small table, watching the clock. She knew Dominic's ego wouldn't let him ignore her. He couldn't stand the idea of a loose end, especially one so close to his big night. She knew he would come to her, one last time, to try and buy her silence or intimidate her into disappearing. And she was right. At 7:30 p.m., a Blacktown car pulled up to the curb. The door opened, and Dominic stepped out, looking wildly out of place against the backdrop of the crumbling industrial street. He walked into the Blueprint with a look of utter contempt, his eyes scanning the sketches on the walls. He didn't see art. He saw a threat that needed to be neutralized. He walked toward her table, his face a mask of cold fury. He didn't sit down. He stood over her, his shadow long and imposing in the dimly lit room. "What is this, Adrienne?" he hissed, gesturing to the room. "A shrine to your bitterness? You think anyone cares about these old drawings? You're a relic. The world has moved on. I have moved on." Adrienne looked up at him, her expression remarkably calm. She didn't see the man she had loved anymore. She saw a structure with a fatal flaw in its foundation. She leaned back in her chair and pointed to the chair across from her. "Sit down, Dominic," she said softly. "The show hasn't even started yet." Dominic laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. "I have a gala to attend. I'm receiving the Sterling Award in an hour. I don't have time for your theatrics. I'm giving you one last chance. $500,000. Sign a non-disparagement agreement and leave the state by tomorrow morning. If you don't, I will use every legal resource I have to ensure you spend the rest of your life in a courtroom you can't afford." He threw a manila envelope on the table, the weight of it echoing in the empty room. He was so confident, so sure of his power, that he didn't notice the small red light on the laptop sitting on the counter behind Adrian. He didn't realize that every word he was saying was being broadcasted to a private server. Adrian didn't touch the envelope. Instead, she checked her watch. 8:15 p.m. "Do you remember the Mason Street project, Dominic?" 8 years ago. The color drained from Dominic's face so fast it was as if a veil had been pulled down. He tried to maintain his composure, but his eyes betrayed him. "That's ancient history," he stammered. "The records were lost in the server migration. There's nothing there." Adrian smiled, a slow, sad smile. "The digital records were lost, yes, because you deleted them. But you forgot that I'm old-fashioned. I like the feel of paper, and I like the security of a safe that doesn't have an internet connection." Dominic took a step toward her, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Where are they? If you've kept those papers, you're an accomplice, Adrian. You'll go down with me." Adrian shook her head. "I didn't keep them to protect myself, Dominic. I kept them because I knew, even then, that one day you would look at me the way you're looking at me now. Like I'm an obstacle to be cleared away. I was the one who designed the safety protocols you ignored. I have the emails where I begged you to use the reinforced steel, and I have your replies telling me to stop being an emotional woman and focus on the aesthetics." Dominic's phone began to vibrate in his pocket. Then it vibrated again, and again. He ignored it, his gaze locked on Adrian. "Whatever you think you have, it's not enough. My lawyers will bury you in motions for a decade." Adrian stood up, her height matching his for the first time in years. "It's not just the Mason Street project, Dominic. It's the journal, the one from our first 5 years. The one where you detailed how you planned to steal the firm from me." Dominic froze. He had forgotten that journal even existed. He had thought it was lost in one of their many moves. The realization that his own words were now a weapon in her hands seemed to physically shrink him. His phone began to chime incessantly, the sound of 100 notifications hitting at once. Dominic finally pulled it out, his thumb shaking as he swiped the screen. His face went from pale to a sickly, ashen gray. The news had broken. The countdown had ended. The headlines were already splashing across every major site. Vance Architects, a foundation of fraud. The secret journal of a tech visionary. The woman behind the man, Adrian Vance, reclaims her designs. Dominic looked at Adrian, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The power imbalance that had defined their lives for 25 years didn't just shift, it shattered. "You destroyed everything," Dominic whispered, the arrogance finally replaced by a raw, naked terror. "The firm, the awards, my reputation, it's all gone." Adrian picked up her glass of wine and took a small, deliberate sip. "No, Dominic," she said, her voice steady and clear. "You destroyed it when you decided that 25 years of partnership was something you could just structure out of existence. I just turned the lights on so everyone could see the ruins." As Dominic's phone rang with a call from his lead counsel, Adrian turned her back on him and walked toward the kitchen. She had a restaurant to run, and for the first time in her life, the only name on the deed was hers. The fallout of the digital leak was instantaneous, but for Adrian, the real work was only beginning. While Dominic was being swarmed by the press outside the ballroom, she was standing in the quiet, dim light of the blueprint, staring at the stack of documents that had once been her life's insurance policy. The first half of her plan had been the explosion. The second half was the systematic dismantling of the empire he had stolen. She knew that in the corporate world, a scandal is a fire that can be extinguished with enough money and a good PR firm. To truly end him, she needed to strike at the heart of his legal standing. She picked up her phone and made one call. It wasn't to a journalist, but to a retired judge she had known for 20 years, a man Dominic thought was safely in his pocket. The next morning, the city woke up to a different world. Dominic Vance's face was on every screen, but not as the visionary of the year. The footage of him being escorted from the gala, stumbling over his own tuxedo trousers while reporters screamed questions about the Mason Street fraud, had gone viral. But Adrian didn't watch the news. She was at the restaurant, meet with a team of forensic accountants she had quietly retained weeks ago. They were sitting at the repurposed bistro tables, surrounded by the blueprints of every major project Vance architects had touched in the last decade. They weren't just looking for fraud. They were looking for the ghost clauses, the hidden legal loops Adrian had intentionally woven into the company's original charter 25 years ago as a fail-safe. Dominic had spent 18 months scrubbing her name from the visible assets, but he had never bothered to read the foundational bylaws of the parent company, A&D Foundations. He had assumed it was a dead entity, replaced by the shiny new Vance Global. What he didn't realize was that Adrian had structured the intellectual property rights so that they were permanently anchored to the original charter. Every design, every patent, and every trademark he had used to build his new empire was technically on loan from a company he no longer controlled. Adrian had quietly reactivated A&D Foundations the day she bought the restaurant. She wasn't just his ex-wife anymore. She was now his landlord and his primary creditor. By noon, the first of the cease and desist orders were being served. They weren't just targeting Dominic. They were hitting his investors, his banks, and the city council. Adrian was effectively freezing every single one of his active construction sites. The Vance Heights project, the multi-billion-dollar waterfront complex that was supposed to be his legacy, ground to a halt as the heavy machinery was turned off. The investors, panicked by the news of the fraud and the sudden legal gridlock, began to pull their funding. Dominic's carefully constructed house of cards wasn't just shaking. The ground beneath it was liquefying. He was losing millions of dollars every hour, and he had no way to stop the bleed. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with the phrase, "The truth wins." We love seeing who stays for the full journey of these complex stories. Your engagement helps us continue to craft these high-stakes narratives for you. Dominic tried to fight back. He sent a team of high-priced lawyers to the restaurant at 4th and Mason, attempting to serve Adrian with a countersuit for industrial espionage and theft of proprietary data. They arrived in 3 black SUVs, looking like a paramilitary force in tailored suits. But when they walked into the bistro, they found Adrian sitting calmly with the retired judge and a representative from the state's attorney's office. She didn't even look up from her coffee. She simply pushed a folder across the table toward them. Inside was the original, hand-signed partnership agreement from 25 years ago, which included a morality and integrity clause that triggered an automatic reversion of all assets if one partner was found to have committed felony-level fraud against the other. The lead lawyer, a man who had spent his career bullying people into submission, went silent as he read the document. He looked at the retired judge, who simply nodded. The trap had been set 2 decades ago, built into the very DNA of the company. Adrian had protected Dominic for years, hoping she would never have to use it. But he had forced her hand. The lawyers left the restaurant without saying a word, their SUVs peeling away from the curb in a spray of gravel. They knew what Dominic didn't want to admit. The game was over. There was no defense against the truth when it was backed by the very laws he thought he had mastered. As the sun began to set on the 3rd day, the pressure became too much for Dominic's inner circle. The ghosts Adrian had contacted The fired engineers and disgraced assistants began to come forward with their own evidence. One by one, they arrived at the blueprint to hand over hard drives, emails, and recorded conversations. The restaurant had become a war room. Adrian sat at the center of it, orchestrating the collapse with the same calm intelligence she had used to design the city's skyline. She wasn't seeking revenge for the sake of pain. She was performing a necessary demolition of a corrupt structure. She was clearing the site so that something honest could be built in its place. The final blow came when the bank initiated a margin call on Dominic's personal loans. He had used his shares in the company as collateral for his lavish lifestyle, the cars, the yachts, the penthouse. With the company's value plummeting to near zero and the assets frozen in litigation, the bank moved to seize everything. Dominic was served with an eviction notice for the very penthouse where he had told Adrian she was nothing. He had 48 hours to vacate. In a desperate, final move, he tried to flee the country, but his passport had already been flagged by the state's attorney's office following the evidence of municipal fraud Adrian had provided. He was trapped in the ruins of his own making. The story reached its climax in a quiet courtroom 2 weeks later. It wasn't a grand trial with a jury. It was a closed-door hearing to settle the distribution of the remaining assets. Dominic looked like a shell of the man he had been at the gala. His expensive suit was wrinkled, and his face was gaunt, the skin gray under the harsh fluorescent lights. He sat at the defense table alone. His lawyers had resigned the day before when his accounts were frozen. Adrian sat across from him, flanked by her team. The judge reviewed the evidence, the journal, the blueprints, the partnership agreement, and rendered a decision in less than an hour. The ruling was absolute. Because of the morality and integrity, trigger, and the documented history of fraud, the divorce settlement was voided. Adrian was awarded 100% of the intellectual property of the firm and the remaining liquid assets to pay back the defrauded investors. Dominic was left with nothing but his personal debts and a looming criminal indictment for the substandard materials used in the Vance Heights project. He was effectively erased from the industry he had tried to dominate. As they walked out of the courtroom, Dominic stopped her in the hallway. "You planned this," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You knew I would do it, and you waited for me to fail." Adrian stopped and looked him in the eye, her expression one of profound sadness rather than triumph. "No, Dominic," she said softly. "I didn't know you would do it. I hoped for 25 years that you wouldn't. But I made sure that if you ever decided to burn our life down, you wouldn't be allowed to keep the matches." She walked away without looking back, leaving him standing in the hallway of the courthouse, a man whose name no longer meant anything to the city that had once adored him. He had spent 18 months trying to take her past, but in doing so, he had forfeited his own future. Today, if you visit the corner of 4th and Mason, you won't find a derelict restaurant. You'll find the Blueprint, a thriving architectural hub and bistro that serves as a sanctuary for young designers and engineers. It is a place built on transparency, where every plan is open to the public and every voice is heard. Adrian Vance still sits at that center table every morning, not as a retired woman, but as a mentor. She rebuilt her life with her last dollar, but she founded it on something far more valuable than money, the unshakable foundation of her own integrity. The man who thought he had taken everything eventually realized that you can't steal the soul of a creator, no matter how many papers you make them sign. The moral of this story is that true power doesn't come from what you own or who you can control. It comes from the truth you carry within yourself. Betrayal may strip you of your titles and your bank account, but it can never take away your skill, your history, or your resilience. When you build your life on a foundation of lies, it doesn't matter how high you climb. The collapse is inevitable. But when you build on integrity, even a collapsing restaurant can become a fortress. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs a reminder of their own strength. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of justice and redemption. We'll see you in the next one.